Every revolution starts in the minds of the people.
Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Wednesday, March 19th, the day after the birthday of the greatest president in U.S. history, Grover Cleveland. Unfortunately, I was not able to get on the mic on his birthday, so I say happy belated birthday to our best president, who shares the distinction of having been elected to non-consecutive terms. So he actually won the popular vote in 3 straight elections in 1888, 1892, in 1884, 1888, and 1892. But in 1888, he lost the Electoral College to a Republican who came in and screwed everything up, as Republicans are wont to do. Now the Democrats, of course, have leapfrogged them and doing even worse when they get in there. But back then, the Democrats were the free market party, the party of limited government, individual liberty. Grover Cleveland was a veto machine. What about this for the veterans? Forget it. Vetoed. And also, the war with Spain that the conservatives in America, and I'm going to do a podcast that's generally some bullet points about my 2015 book, Where Do Conservatives and Liberals Come From? To me, and I think I prove it in that book, the conservatives in 19th century America were the Federalists, then the Whigs, then the new Republican Party that started in the 1850s. Not to be confused with the Jeffersonian Republicans, who were originally opponents of the Federalists. And they were really the Libertarian Party. And that's what the Democratic Party was for most of the 19th century, up until William Jennings Bryan. Of course, they had that slavery issue. Now, not all the Democrats were pro-slavery or signed on to the white man's party, which is what the Democratic Party marketed itself as at some point. But in any case, Grover Cleveland was a free market guy. He was anti-war, and he resisted under heavy pressure going to war with Spain, a war that the conservatives had wanted all the way since Alexander Hamilton had wrote, we should raise an army and basically just grab all of Spain's possessions because we can, perceiving them as weak and past their prime. Hamilton felt, why don't we just take, and eventually that's what a future U.S. president did. He cooked up some pretense, but those are subjects for another day. I want to talk today about this whole brouhaha about judges who are telling Trump that he can't use the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to deport, I know, the members of a criminal gang called Tren de Aragua. That's 670 days of Duolingo. I know the word train means train. It's spelled differently. As far as I can tell, Aragua is just a proper name. I couldn't find a translation for that. So it's the train of Aragua. But this is a gang, I guess, that was formed in prison. Some people that, not too many people would disagree. They don't want him around, right? And of course, I am, all for a lot of Trump's efforts to control immigration, at least under the present circumstances where we don't have property rights as we should in the United States. We don't have the freedom to associate with whomever we want or not associate with whomever we want, the unqualified right to kick anybody out of our property that we want. And most importantly, most of the land in the United States, well, I shouldn't say most, way too large a percentage of the land of the United States is owned by the government, like 27% overall. And west of the Mississippi, I believe it's in the 40s. So it's technically owned by the government. So under their theory, since we're the government, we the people, we all own this land collectively. No, I don't want any part of owning it, neither the responsibility or the cost or the implications, but I'm dragooned into owning it along with you and everybody else because the federal government cannot abide, unowned land, unsettled land, which could be homesteaded by people who need a house, by the way, or can't afford housing in the vastly overpriced coastal areas, thanks to regulation, the Fed, and many other factors. So, any land that's not owned by somebody, and I'm doing the air quotes now, owned, because, none of us really own our land. We have to pay rent to the government. They call them property taxes and school taxes. But if we don't pay them, they take our land away. So we're really just renting it, which is not right either. But so in any case, yeah, until the time when we have a private property system and virtually all land is privately owned. I mean, I'd like a privately owned government too, with competing firms protecting our property, as opposed to the federal government doing so, which is laughable at best. Um, but even if we had a limited government with a private property system, something like we had at one time in the United States, okay, we could talk about so-called open borders, where if you cross the border, no one's paying your rent, no one's paying to feed you or clothe you, you're on your own. And if you can contribute, then, you're welcome to go rent an apartment or buy a house. And right now, that should be the case. Or if somebody here wants to sponsor you. I know some of my ancestors had to be sponsored to come to the United States. Basically, someone says, I'm going to make sure this person doesn't become a liability for the public. Okay, but those days are over. So I think you have to talk about immigration in those terms. And of course, Trump was elected with, if he has a mandate, and I don't like those terms because, look, he won by a couple million votes, and even landslides going back decades. The difference in votes is rarely all that much, even when you win, 40 states or something like that. You look at the votes in each of those states, and it's not all that much. But in any case, I think a lot of people want something done about immigration, especially after what happened over the previous 4 years, the previous administration, where we're just flooded with people. And again, I mean, these are not people, for the most part, who are coming to make an immediate positive contribution. That's why we have to put them up in hotels. So the Martha's Vineyard part of it was so funny that even they said they didn't have the resources to take care of like 50 immigrants. Boy, they got them out of there and onto an army base awful quickly, didn't they? Well, I'm sorry for the open borders people. If you're saying these people are making a contribution or they don't need to be supported, well, why do you need resources? They should just walk in and start looking for an apartment. Okay. But we all know that's not what's happening. And I'm not really blaming the people coming here. I mean, they're coming from horrific conditions, in some cases created by U.S. foreign policy, bombing their countries, overthrowing their governments. So much like the Ukrainians in the Ukraine war, they're victims. It's just that we just are not able to absorb, the other 7.5 billion people who live outside the borders of the United States, at any time, especially not in 4 years. So in any case, what Trump is trying to do, though, is get some of the worst people that are coming out fast. And, due process takes a long time, and it's often evaded by the people who come, here illegally, and maybe they'll apply for asylum or there'll be some other reason where, they come, they're given a court date and they never show up. And we should know that most people who have an illegal alien status, I can't even remember what the politically correct term is. It's still undocumented, or is that racist too now? I have no idea. but they have that status because not so much that they like snuck in, or swam the Rio Grande, the old cliche, or came in under the cover of night. Many do. The majority of people with the illegal alien status came in here quasi legally. If you say like applying for asylum, no, that's legal to do that. Then they just never show up for their court date, or they do get a work visa and they just overstay it. So we've got millions of these people. And, as a libertarian, the ones I'm concerned about are the troublemakers, right? If they're working under the table and not paying taxes, I'm not really too worried about that. We have all these public services where there's not a direct, you pay this tax, you get this benefit, like hospitals that provide care. And if you can't pay, then Medicare pay, or I'm sorry, Medicaid pays, and other certain public schools where, they just send out a bill to all the property owners, whether you're using the school or not. Okay. And of course, these people are a burden on that. Now, those things shouldn't exist, but it's another one of those cases where we don't have a libertarian solution. So, as a libertarian, I'm saying, well, no, we can't just admit more people to pile on to these services which shouldn't exist and explode the cost of them, you know, until we get to somewhere where property rights are protected. We probably have to limit the number of people coming in. So that's where I'm at. I know I keep digressing off this Alien Enemies Act, but I'm getting to it. So it's very ironic that Trump goes back and finds this. It's still on the books, apparently. And in general, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 was part of a series of statutes that the Congress passed, the Federalist Congress, during the presidency of John Adams. And these were hugely unpopular. In fact, you could say that they launched or relaunched the political career of Thomas Jefferson, who at the time was not in the government. He had retired. Remember, he left the Washington administration. He resigned as Secretary of State back in I think it was 1793. And I did a podcast, I did a Substack article about the Gannett affair. So you should go read that. And that reminds me to tell you to, subscribe to my Substack. You can be a free subscriber. You can be a paying subscriber. The paying subscribers get even more content. But usually what I write about there is not duplicated here on the podcast. So you got all kinds of written content to subscribe to there at my Substack. There's a link on the show notes page to this episode. And of course, subscribe to this podcast, share it with a friend, get on my email list if you're not already there. If you just go to my website, tommullentalksfreedom.com, something will pop up and you'll get to sign up on my email list and get a free copy of my book. It's The Fed Stupid. And I've got an interview coming up with Jonathan Newman of the Mises Institute. So now's a good time to download that book, get a little general information about the Fed, and then my questions and his answers will make a lot more sense. So anyway, 1798, the quasi-war with Spain is going on, where there's no declared war, but France, if you remember from the Gannett affair, France had been trying to enforce the mutual defense treaty that the United States signed with King Louis, under which France helped the United States quite a bit towards the end of the Revolutionary War. And then they declared, well, a few things happened. They deposed their king and eventually cut his head off, starting the blueprint for every left-wing revolution since. The Russians followed suit. And of course, the French Revolution was the blueprint for every left. They did the statues with the French Revolution, get rid of the statues, rename all the streets. They changed the calendar. They came up with a new name. Everyone's supposed to call each other citizen. In Russia, it was comrade. Now it's they, them. Okay. It's always the same. But anyway, so this French revolutionary left-wing government cuts off the king's head, declares war on England, and then they want the United States to come and fight England with them, and the United States wasn't interested. And, you could debate whether their reasoning was valid. It kind of sounds like they weaseled out of their treaty, but they said, look, we signed the treaty with the king, and the king's no longer with us, thanks to you. So that treaty's no longer with us. So, the French never really accepted this answer. In 1798, they were again at war with England, and they started attacking American shipping. Does this sound familiar? Um, Based on America trading with the British or otherwise being friendly with the British. And so you have this quasi war where no one has declared war. And back then that actually meant something. And during this, they pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. Oh, and the reason I brought up the Gannett Affair was that once again, as with the Gannett Affair, there were French people in the United States, not U.S. citizens, but French visitors, French citizens, who were stirring up a lot of trouble. And of course, the French Revolution and government was still very popular with the Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans. Okay. And I think that was a big mistake on their part. One of the few things I would side with the Federalists on against the Jeffersonian Republicans was that the French Revolution was a disaster. They should have recognized that sooner. It may have started very early on as something akin to the American Revolution when people like Lafayette were seated in the assembly, but it soon became nothing like that. And it was basically poisoned from the beginning because it was based on the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is like the father of the modern left. Every poisonous bad idea, I've said before, in modern America, you can trace a lot of what we hear today to Marcuse, but it really all goes back to Rousseau. Just awful, as opposed to John Locke, who inspired the American Revolution. But in any case, you got all these French troublemakers on American soil agitating for the U.S. to come into the war on the side of France. And the Federalists and John Adams wanted to kick them out. And of course, they couldn't depend on support from the Republicans on this. So they didn't want to go through due process. And they passed these 4 acts. And one of them had to do with naturalization. So that's clearly a power delegated to the federal government in the Constitution. The word is in there. Okay. And that's naturalization concerns who becomes a citizen. And the Federalists changed the requirements for that. No problem. They also passed a Sedition Act. And this is where most of the outcry came from. And what most people remember about the Alien and Sedition Acts is that they passed a law making it illegal to criticize the president and various other officials in the cabinet and elsewhere, but not the vice president. Okay, so the vice president at the time was Thomas Jefferson, a political opponent. Remember, it used to be that the president, the guy who got the most votes was president, and the guy who got the second most votes was vice president. So there was always a rival sitting in the vice president's chair. And, that was meant to keep the president honest. They got rid of that after the whole Aaron Burr thing, which is unfortunate in some ways, maybe in other ways not. But in any case, they passed the Sedition Act and they put people in jail for criticizing John Adams' policies. And, the war drums were beating from the Federalists, wanted to go to war with France over their actions mainly at sea. And the Republicans wanted to go to war with England. So, you have this political fight. It's very vitriolic. The country is very divided over this. Okay. So a lot of this probably sounds familiar. Not so much like who do we go to war with, but over other things. And they threw people in jail who criticized the president. And boy, oh boy, were some of the criticisms funny. John Adams was not the most handsome figure in American political history. Unlike Jefferson, who's tall and good looking, Adams was short, fat, and toothless. Very brilliant, although I think very conflicted philosophically, but another subject for another day. So that was the Sedition Act. Now, there were two other acts. The reason they refer to them as the Alien and Sedition Acts is there were two acts that had to do with aliens, what we would now term immigration. One was the Alien Enemies Act, and the other was the Alien Friends Act. So basically, what these acts did was give the president power to kick these people out of the country, if they were causing trouble without due process. And Jefferson and Madison both saw these as powers not delegated to the federal government. Now, when this launched what were called the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and the whole idea of state nullification of federal laws was born because of these acts. And I'll post a link to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, wherein both Jefferson and Madison say the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. They exercised powers not delegated to the federal government. In a couple of years later, Madison wrote the Report of 1800, where he did clarify. And this is the subject of redoing the pod. The only do-over in Tom Mullen Talks Freedom History. I didn't make this clear enough on the first try, so I've actually reissued this one to make this clarification. 2 years later, Madison made clear that the objection was not to the Alien Enemies Act, because that applied to when the United States was in a state of war, which Congress had the power to declare, and then the president had the power to execute. That's not his exact words. I'll link to it. You can go read it, what he said. Specifically, the objection was to the Alien Friends Act. And basically, the argument that they made was that anybody who got kicked out of the country, and these were French people, the French troublemakers that the Republicans liked and the Federalists didn't, that the president kicking them out under the Alien Enemies Act was wrong, because we're not at war with France. No war has been declared. Some ships taking shots at each other didn't constitute a war. That you have to declare a war, and only Congress can do that. And they hadn't done that with France. And to his credit, I mean, John Adams was trying everything he could to avoid war with France. It really lost him the support of his own party and probably a second term. So good on John Adams, who actually said that he wanted on his gravestone, that he avoided a war. So, things were different back then. Of course, the Federalists were hot and heavy to go to war with France. So he did want to kick out troublemakers trying to get us into a war with England. Okay, these were French citizens, non-U.S. citizens. And so they said, well, you can't use the Enemies Act because we're not at war. And you can't, the Alien Friends Act is unconstitutional on its face. And basically what he was saying is that the regulating immigration as we understand it today is not a federal power. It's not delegated to the federal government. It must reside with the states. And although immigration was very unregulated for a big part of U.S. history, it was the states who were regulating immigration. And the feds coming in there and trying to do it was unconstitutional, according to both Madison and Jefferson. Madison went so far as to say a power nowhere delegated. In fact, I guess I wanted to read you the actual words that he wrote. I always remember nowhere delegated because in the language of the time, or at least Madison's language of the time, the word nowhere was two words. He was no space where. So that makes it easy to find. Of course, now I have to find it on my, here we go. All right, so here's what Madison wrote in the Virginia Resolution of 1798, that the General Assembly doth particularly protest against the palpable and alarming infractions of the Constitution in the two late cases of the Alien and Sedition Acts passed at the last session of Congress, the first of which exercises a power nowhere delegated to the federal government, and which by uniting legislative and judicial powers to those of the executive subverts the general principles of free government, as well as the particular organization and positive provisions of the federal Constitution. So that's all about the Alien Act, the Alien Friends Act. He doesn't make that clear here. And the other of which acts, and now he's talking about the Sedition Act. So he says, and the other of which acts exercises in like manner a power not delegated to the Constitution, but on the contrary, expressly and positively forbidden by one of the amendments there too. So what he's saying is that the Sedition Act, controlling criticism of the government, not only is not delegated to the federal government, it's prohibited by the First Amendment. Okay, so that was the objection. And again, they just say Alien and Sedition Acts in the resolutions of 1798 and leave it to people to understand the distinction between the Alien and Enemies Act and the Alien Friends Act, two different laws. He makes that distinction clear in the report of 1800. So Madison, the guy who wrote the Constitution, is saying that regulating immigration is not a federal power. It's a state power. And in fact, up until 1875, that the states were the ones who regulated. It's not like this is a theory. This was a fact. I remember there was a debate between two libertarians, and they basically said that there was no regulation of immigration up until the feds started doing it, in the late 19th century. Not true. In fact, the way the federal government acquired illegitimately the power to regulate immigration was just another Supreme Court case where they just discovered it. It's not written in there, but it's somewhere in there between the lines. And that was a case called Chai Lung versus Freeman. I'll link to that on the show notes page. And the whole case was about how the California Department of Immigration was treating Chinese immigrants, specifically a woman who took offense to being charged. Basically, the background of this is that if you were immigrating into California in the 1870s, there were a ton of Chinese immigrants that came to work on the railroads, okay? And they were mostly men. Women didn't work on the railroads back then. But there were women coming in, and a lot of those were prostitutes for the men. And if you were a woman coming in, you were immediately suspected of being a prostitute, because why else are you coming, right? Now, it wasn't true that they were all prostitutes, but there was this general suspicion. And if you were suspected of being a prostitute, or I can't remember how they termed it, coming in for immoral purposes or some whatever, Victorian construction, then you had to pay like $75 to come into the country. All right. And this person got charged the 75 and sued over it. And, went through the court system. It gets to the Supreme Court. And instead of just ruling on the case, the Supreme Court says, you know what? The state shouldn't even be doing immigration. This is a federal power. And you can read the decision for yourself. I mean, they make some weak, ways to say arguments, very superficial about how it's in the Constitution. But their main argument isn't even that it's in the Constitution. It's just that it would be bad if it wasn't. So it must be in there. And I mean, they make a pretty compelling argument. Hey, what if the Chinese government took exception, or some other country, to the way a single state was handling immigration and declared war? Now it's all our problem. Okay, very compelling argument about why maybe immigration should be delegated to the federal government, but that's not an argument for how it was already delegated to the federal government because it wasn't. And that's why the states were doing it. Okay, so at that point, if you buy the Supreme Court's argument, and believe me, there's arguments against what they say as well, get to that shortly. If you buy what they say, the remedy is to offer an amendment to the Constitution, removing the power to regulate immigration from the states and delegating it to the federal government. That's all. Offer an amendment. But they didn't. Nobody did. The federal government just declared it. And, just like Roe versus Wade, whatever you think of abortion, an idiotic decision where they discovered I think it came down like there's a right to privacy or something. I mean, the way they got to state laws cannot prohibit abortion was so convoluted. I mean, even some liberal lawyers at the time said this is a mess. And by the way, the Supreme Court did not, declare that this is a state power. All they declared was the federal government couldn't overturn state laws based on the argument in Roe versus Wade. They mentioned, might be different if Congress passed a law. So I can't remember what that language is called. The lawyers out there will know when, the court just muses about things that aren't a material part of their decision, then that's called a certain kind of language. And I don't feel like looking it up in front of all of you, but the lawyers can pitch in the comments. But in any case, the fact that language is in there indicates the court might be receptive to the idea that Congress can pass a law either banning abortion nationally or prohibiting states from banning it nationally. So, like all the other decisions this supposedly radical court has made, they've upheld most of the status quo. The two poisonous doctrines that have, largely created so much of the federal government through the court system, the incorporation doctrine related to the 14th Amendment and the non-delegation doctrine. In other words, it's called the non-delegation doctrine, but it's supposed to prevent Congress from delegating away their legislative power. And of course, that's what they did in the New Deal and every agency that writes its own laws since then. And, the courts now just say, well, you can't do it too much. And in whose opinion? Well, ours. So anyway, the courts just discover this is a federal power. The feds start regulating it. And, it has all of the same problems that centralizing anything in a monopoly has. It's like everything else. Kicking it up to Washington doesn't make it better. It just makes it a monopoly, basically. Where with the states, they had the freedom to regulate immigration lightly, heavily, in a nuanced way, whatever the people of those states decided. And it's very ironic that during the Biden administration, Governor DeSantis and the Governor Abbott of Texas, DeSantis of Florida, Abbott of Texas, wanted to employ state resources to basically regulate immigration. And they have to twist themselves into knots to try to justify this reconcile it with the idea that it's a federal power. Okay, so if it was a state power, they would just go to their state assemblies and, pass and sign a new immigration law and says, this is, our policy on coming into our state. But since not only did Republicans usurp this power and give it to the federal government unconstitutionally, in my opinion, then they spent decades trying to tell us that, yeah, it really is in the Constitution, just like the judges said. Now, of course, these judges are doing what conservatives say they hate, which is, just making stuff up, finding things in the Constitution that aren't there, right? Roe versus Wade is one idea, but most of the New Deal, they were making the same arguments, and all the poisonous children of the New Deal, subsequent agencies that were created after that by the same method. Congress creates an agency, tells them they can write their own laws, not constitutional. Okay. The legislative power is delegated solely to Congress. They don't get to delegate that to somewhere else without an amendment to the Constitution, which has never been done and would never pass. Right. So, in any case, now Trump. So, okay, let me get back to the state governors. They have to try to make this an invasion. And then there's some language in the Constitution where their state governors can do certain things during an invasion. And look, as somebody who wants this controlled myself, who wants the same ends, that's not the way to do it. This is not an invasion. Clearly, the founders, the framers, James Madison, when he wrote the word invasion, did not mean people just coming over the border, which he confirmed without any ambiguity in his resolution of 1798 and his report of 1800. Okay. He, in fact, said that what the administration in 1798 was doing was conflating alien friends who, were strictly under the purview of the states with alien enemies because we were not at war. So even people from the country whose military was attacking the United States at the time, okay, even that didn't qualify for James Madison, the guy who wrote the Constitution. So certainly some destitute, illiterate people wandering in from Honduras, however illegally, doesn't constitute an invasion. So no, Trump trying to use the Enemies Act, he's doing the same thing that John Adams was doing in 1798. And Adams with way more justification, because these people were trying to get the United States into a war with England. Okay. The people coming in, whatever economic harm they might do. And of course, I don't agree with the whole, wages thing, but they're certainly consuming resources, taxpayer resources at a high level, especially when they first get here, and some of them forever. Okay. But they're not invading. They're not a military crossing the border. And that's what invasion means in the Constitution. Okay. Scream all you want. Now, Texas, Florida, every red state could be regulating immigration themselves without having to twist themselves that this is an invasion or that we're at war with, I don't know, everybody that every country that an immigrant comes from. It's stupid. They have to do this because they can't recognize that it was always a state power. They're the ones who put us in this mess, having the feds do it. So yeah, no, I don't agree with Trump on this. I agree with him kicking these people out, but he's got to use due process. No, you can't ignore the judges. And these are left-wing judges that are not acting in good faith. They're very selective about when they care about the Constitution, only when it's something that benefits them. But unfortunately, when they're right, even if they're right for the wrong reasons or they have bad motives or they're acting in bad faith. So even the criminal gang, people will sometimes say, well, the Constitution doesn't apply to non-citizens. Of course it does. Well, first of all, if you want to kick somebody out of the country, you got to prove they're not a citizen. You got to prove you got the right guy, okay? It's not like the government never arrests the wrong person. So yeah, due process applies to everybody. And it's not just, these protections of the Bill of Rights are not for traffic violations. They're for serious crimes. Terrorists deserve due process. And all of the rights that the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights guarantee. Yes, terrorists. Because first of all, we got to prove they're a terrorist. All right. Otherwise, whether they're a citizen or not, you may be convicting an innocent man. Now, we've convicted 9/11 terrorists in federal court. No problem. All right. It's not like it doesn't work. But I remember when one of the two guys that blew up the Boston Marathon many years ago. And they were saying, well, he doesn't have a right. The Miranda thing that's a whole kettle of worms of whether that's valid or not. But to the extent that it's valid for a citizen, it's definitely valid for this terrorist, right? Because we haven't proven anything about this guy. Even if we're pretty sure he did it, you got to go through the process because sometimes we're pretty sure they did it and they didn't. Derek Chauvin is now coming up for you right wingers. Okay. Got all this video of him appearing to kneel on the guy's neck. I don't know if he did it on his shoulder or his neck. I can't remember if I ever could tell. It's a submission move that I did like 7,000 times when I trained martial arts for over 30 years, right? So every move to the ground had some kind of, either get up and run away or pin the guy's head and the back of his shoulder with your two knees to the ground. That wasn't exactly what he was doing, but it's not like this was, something akin to scalping. Like I drilled that over and over, and I thought that would come up. Maybe it did at his trial. But like nobody should want to see due process ever set aside for anybody. This is why the kill list that first, became declared by Obama that he could just go kill the U.S. citizen because he was a, pro-terrorist troublemaker. Not a good guy, but deserved due process. And then, of course, Trump, he killed that Iranian general. Well, we just didn't like him, so we killed him. Are we at war? No. With Iran? No, at least not yet. Not at that time. Did we hold any kind of a trial for this guy? No, we just killed him. Okay. Not good because it's really not hyperbole to say you could be next. All right. Back during the early days of the war on terror, it's like we libertarians are always getting yelled at by somebody. So the right wingers were in charge. They start the war on terror. And we were saying, guys, don't do this. We don't like terrorists either, but you cannot weaken, dilute, set aside all these due process laws, imprisonment without a warrant, all this. You can't do this, or someday it's going to be used against you. Can I say January 6th? I mean, how many times do we have to be right before, the conservatives and the liberals will come back and are dunking on us? They think they are when we bring stuff up like this again. Okay. Yeah, we're always right. It's not easy being us. So in any case, yeah, Trump shouldn't do this. It's still not too late to offer an amendment, by the way, to the Constitution, formally declaring that regulating immigration is a federal power. Now, a lot of people say, well, all the blue states, they want mass immigration. Not only is offering an amendment the only way you can get consent of the governed for a new power, but the process of people arguing about what the wording is might produce wording that most 3/4 of the states agree with, including blue states and red states. It might not. And if it doesn't pass, it's not a federal power because no one ever delegated, no one ever consented for the federal government to have that power. Okay. And this is why everything, Social Security should have been an amendment. Okay. I would have opposed it, but at least it would be a federal power to run a retirement plan. And maybe it would have been different. Maybe it would have been better. Maybe it wouldn't have passed if it had. It probably wouldn't have, because maybe it would. The country was in rather a state of hysteria during the 30s and elected the worst president in history 4 straight times. That's how bad it got, prolonging a depression that should have lasted a year into something that really didn't end until after World War II. No, the war did not end the depression. Remind me to do an episode on my dad dropping the bottle of ketchup, and I'll tell you why. That has something to do with it. But in any case, had the Republicans never usurped the power to regulate immigration, their states could be regulating it right now. And there's more red states than blue states, a lot more. And they could have any immigration policy they want. It's not too late. I mean, bring a case and make this one of your arguments. You overturn Roe versus Wade. I know that's more popular with conservatives. Get Shylong versus Freeman overturned and return it to the states. And let's see, when they can't let these people in and ship them all over the country, and they have to keep them themselves, whether all these blue states remain so open borders. We'll see. I have my doubts. Even New York up here is starting to say no mas, right? So I guess that'll do it for today. I wanted to clarify the Alien Enemies and Friends Acts. And actually, the clarification makes it even more applicable to what's going on, because Trump is trying to say we're at war because of illegal immigration. A war per the Constitution, even the war on terror, is not a constitutional war. A war per the Constitution is a formal state that's declared by Congress against another country or countries, right? Not against, multinational people that are just, walking in. It's just not. And neither is it against terrorists. We do have a provision in the Constitution to deal with non-state actors. They're called letters of marque and reprisal. And Ron Paul actually suggested that those be issued to go after the 9/11 terrorists. Okay? Something like what Israel did to the people who, was it bombed or committed some atrocity at one of the Olympics. All right? Just hunt them down. Hire people. Okay? Perfectly constitutional. No, we want to send 140,000 people to fight the Taliban who had nothing to do with it. And then a whole bunch of others to go to Iraq. Meanwhile, the guy supposedly who's a mastermind behind it, I don't think bin Laden was the mastermind, but that's another story as well. He's sitting around for 10, 12 years after this, hanging out in the country that we're funding, by the way, Pakistan. Oh, my goodness. Anyway, that'll do it on today. I hope you found this informative. I'll post lots of good links. If you're watching the YouTube, then where you see show notes, that'll go to the show notes page on my website. You'll find my article on this from 8 or 10 years ago. You'll find the actual text of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, the report of 1800, the text of Shylong versus Freeman. Go read it for yourself and see what you think. Look forward to your comments.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.